All right. I am now joined by current affairs editor Nathan Robinson, who has written about William F. Buckley before on current affairs and has talked to me for current affairs about Christopher Hitchens. So I thought this would be a fun one to do with him. How are you doing today, Nathan?
Indeed, two of my favorites. I'm doing pretty well. I'm a Buckley scholar. So this is a good choice for me.
Yeah,
you're the Hitchens scholar. I'm the Buckley scholar.
There you go. I did actually read Buckley's first book, God and Man in Yale, a couple of years ago. Since I sort of, I mean, maybe it's masochistic, but I mean, I sort of feel like I'm not going to go all Matt McManus and read like 20 of them at a time, but like I sort of feel vaguely obliged to keep myself honest by reading some of the, some conservative books, like a couple of years or so. And I will say this, I think it's like a repulsive book in a lot of ways, but the last conservative book I read before that was The Right Side of History: How Reason and Moral Purpose Made the West Great by Ben Shapiro. And I will say, just as a stylist, Buckley is a pleasure to read after Shapiro.
Yeah, no, you got to read God and Man in Yale, foundational text of the modern conservative movement, in which Buckley, recently graduated from Yale, whines that all of his professors are secularists undoing Western civilization. It's an audacious debut for a young writer. And it's become a whole genre now, right? There are so many of those criticisms of academia books, and he really started. Dinesh D'Souza then wrote the same book again, and Ben Shapiro wrote the same book again.
Yeah, I think that's kind of true, although the interesting thing about it is that some of the later books in that genre of the conservative anti-campus book were all about how there's stifling conformism in universities and dissenting voices aren't allowed and things like this. Whereas Buckley, in the foundational text, is kind of the opposite. I mean, he's just very openly and frankly, I mean, it's an anti-free speech book. The thesis of the book, very explicitly, is that Yale should fire all of these people he thinks are atheists and socialists.
That's true. I mean, he doesn't argue that there is that the atheism necessarily is ubiquitous. He just points to all of these. He's like, look at these people not teaching good Christian doctrine in accordance with the founding charter of Yale.
Yeah, it's just funny too, because I don't know that the founders of Yale would have been that tolerant of Catholics, Buckley. But who knows? Maybe they would have been. I have my doubts. But in any case, this is so. Before we actually watch the debate, I ran across something recently I want to show you. I just want to show you the first 2 minutes of it. So sometimes you'll see people bemoaning how we don't have the kind of reactionaries that we used to, that we used to have these people like William F. Buckley, and now we have these these sort of pale shadows of that that we have now. And I know you've been critical of that line. I remember in your Buckley piece you say something like this sort of sophisticated conservative we used to have. One of the television moments he's most famous for is calling Orfanel a fucking queer and threatening to hit him in the mouth. So
I think he said "goddamn." I think he didn't say "fucking." I think the quote is, "Stop calling me a crypto-Nazi, or I'll punch you in the goddamn face."
That's right. Okay.
Yeah. Didn't quite go to the F-bomb, but real nasty stuff, right? Homophobic slurs and threats of violence. That's our great distinguished conservative sophisticate of ages past.
Well, what we have now is Jordan Peterson, and I was just checking in on Jordan Peterson as you do, seeing what he's putting out there, and I found this. So here's the first 2 minutes of this clip.
interviewed that's been most popular?
Noam Chomsky, and you're one of the reasons why, because I was the first person, if not the only person, to ask him about you directly.
Uh-oh. So I don't know about that. So there's something we could talk about right away. So what did he have to say?
Well, essentially, you're Hitler, as you know. And,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And
so why do you think he thinks that?
I think that people who are on a certain side on the political spectrum believe their side stands for what's good, and the opposite side is what's not good. See, that's so tricky, man. Talking about better, left, and center, which we'll get to later, is how to define the left and the right. It's decidedly difficult. Almost everyone has a different definition. Chomsky would say, well, the left is freedom, and so anything that's on the right is anti-freedom. And the right, people who are on the right or identify with being as such, would perhaps categorize it as the opposite.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, at least, that they might circle around claims to some, let's say, virtue that both of them would admire, like freedom. Right? Mm-hmm. So there's some agreement there, despite the difference. Did he point to anything particular about what I hypothetically thought that made me not an acceptable sort of creature?
No, it's somewhat hearsay in the sense that he read an article based on you. So he didn't watch you directly. He read Nathan Robinson's critique of you, which I'm sure.
Oh yeah, well that'll do it, man. Yeah, old Nathan. Yeah. He's quite the character.
Oh man, beautiful! I had not seen that. That's incredible. I'm sure Chomsky didn't say he was Hitler, because my article, Chomsky's basic take is the take of my article, which is that Peterson often speaks such gibberish that it's hard to actually get a coherent ideological program out of him, which, you know.
Yeah, no, exactly. I would be shocked if Chomsky said anything like that he was Hitler.
But I do believe that the guy's misinterpreting.
Yeah, he says, this guy says, just a heads up, Chomsky did not say this to Kirk. Kirk completely misunderstood a comment of his concerning Peterson.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I wouldn't expect Chomsky to be a fan, and I think that, quite apart from having read your article, that, I mean, look, what's one of the things that, one of the things that I like the most that Chomsky has said in a sort of more like abstract theoretical register than most of what Chomsky writes is that the way we should look at hierarchies is that that we don't need to just sort of reject them a priori wholesale, but like we should look at them with suspicion. They should have to, the burden of proof should be on thinking that they need to justify themselves. And of course, this is like on a sort of deep spiritual level. This is exactly the opposite of, to the extent that he's actually saying things and not just babbling, exactly the opposite of what Peterson thinks.
Yeah. I still want to get Peterson to debate me. He keeps saying things like this about me. He said I must have gotten under his skin at some point, because he sent a number of tweets indicating he'd like to talk to me. But I've emailed a couple times his publicity email now, and they have not replied to me. So if anyone knows how to goad Peterson into a debate, I still want to do this now. But now I got a new blurb, which is Nathan, quite a character. What did he say?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I think that well, anyway, people should read the article. It's the Intellectual We Deserve. Is that the
it's called The Intellectual We Deserve. Yes, because I blame all of us for Jordan Peterson. It's easy to look at Jordan Peterson and think that man is a babbling fool. But the question is, why have we built a society in which this babbling fool is selling millions of copies of his books? That's the real question. and for that, blame is widespread.
Yeah, now that there's no arguing with that. So I think I should actually also shout out whenever this cluster of topics comes up. I think that I think definitely the most entertaining critique of Jordan Peterson that anybody has done is still the one from 2018 from Natalie Wynn on the YouTube like video essay where it's Natalie at her most entertaining, but also she has like I think she makes some really really good points in it, including the fact that Peterson's central thing about how he should be, about how, human beings are innately hierarchical because of blah, 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 lobsters, blah, 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 evolution, blah, 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 Jungian archetypes, and therefore, the left, by trying to destroy hierarchies, is just trying to mess with human nature. And this could only lead to chaos and disaster and gulags. That, she points out that this is a timeless argument, that there is absolutely nothing about this that's specific to anything that people are arguing about now. Like, you could just cut and paste that argument and have it be made by a French monarchist in the 1780s, or an
William
antebellum.
Buckley makes it in the debate we're watching tonight.
Fair enough. He probably does. I'm trying to.
He has the part where he talks about how the women's movement, where Hitchens defends women's liberation, and Buckley launches into the classic, like, all revolutions produce something worse than the thing that they were against. Yeah, right. And I mean, this is no different, than you could have an antebellum slaveholder say that. You could have anybody say that, because there's nothing about it that's specific to why particular instances of social progress is bad. It's just a sort of general anti-social progress argument that's equally good or equally bad regardless of context. That was an important realization for me, helping me understand the common structure of the conservative narrative. And Albert Hirschman's The Rhetoric of Reaction was really informative for this, because he talks about how conservative arguments are often all kind of the same. They're all, this social change that you want is going to create something worse than what we have already. It's going to undo civilization, and it's all of our traditional values will disappear. And every and Hirschman goes through hundreds of years of reactionary rhetoric. It shows they say the same things. Natalie, though, takes Jordan Peterson's ideas more seriously than I do. I treat him as someone who is mostly bereft of ideas, but she actually treats him intellectually seriously. So he has not responded to her critique either, because he's not an intellectually serious person.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, he's certainly not. I think if anybody had any lingering doubt about that, I think that the tweet that he put out a couple days ago, where he finally answered Zizek's question from 2019, and he put out his list of the postmodern neo-Marxists, and it includes it includes numerous people who aren't either postmodernists or Marxists or anything like that. That they like who are just none of the above. It includes like Catherine McKinnon, who actually was an extremely harsh critic of postmodernism.
I mean, it was basically just a list of people Peterson has heard of, who he vaguely associates with values he deplores. So it's like, Naomi Klein, Ta-Nehisi Coates, although he put a second hyphen between Ta-Nehisi and Coates, which is either like a deliberate attempt to mock Coates' name, in which case it's kind of gross and racist, or ignorant. But both. No, that's funny.
Yeah, I mean, I expect it's ignorant. In fact, what I suspect it really is this the sign of deep sloppiness, right? That he hasn't,
He hasn't read a book by a single one of the 20 people he cites. I guarantee you he has not read a book by any of them.
Yeah. Well, I think, if anybody is watching and knows a way to get in touch with Jordan Peterson to actually make this happen, let's do that. He has
his arguments, which he doesn't do ever.
No, he certainly doesn't. Right? I think I would say, like, I certainly like Slavoj Žižek a lot more than you do, and I think, and I do have my defense, as you know, of like what he did in that debate, but I also think that it's not a coincidence, like that this is the one that he was interested in having. That that, for example, like Richard Wolff had made the offer beforehand, and he wasn't going to have that, right? And I also think that there's a reason why maybe he will now, right? But there's a reason why in the past, he wasn't interested in doing it with you, because I think that I think with anybody who argues in a more analytical way, I think that he's worried that he would be embarrassed.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna pin him down on stuff. We're gonna go, okay, let's go through these figures, and you're going to justify how each one of them is a postmodern neo-Marxist.
Yeah, corporate consultant Robin DiAngelo is a postmodern neo-Marxist. It's just barely anybody on that list is even Marxish. Never mind a Marxist, and there are a lot of non-post, people who just haven't written anything one way or the other about postmodernism. There's at least one person who's a very harsh critic of postmodernism. I think that's exactly it's just a list of writers who he sees as
I'm glad he put the list out. I'm glad he did, because people ask him, okay, well, who do you mean? What do you mean? And by answering that question, he reveals that he doesn't know what he's talking about at all, right? That by answering it, by being forced to actually list who the postmodern neo-Marxists are, he showed that he is just he's talking out of his ass, and Naomi Klein. What? What's postmodern about the shock doctrine? Her book is about the Green New Deal. What are you talking about? Sorry.
Yeah. No, exactly. Like I was.
Okay.
She's a. She's. I mean, she's not a. I mean, I don't think she's particularly, philosophically inclined. She's just somebody who writes, earnestly and enthusiastically about social democratic policies. So, how that has anything to do with any of the elements of that label is kind of beyond me. But
very stupid, man.
Yeah, fair enough. All right. Well, hey, we should.
Let's get the popcorn out and let's get down to business.
Yes.
The failure of the Democratic Party in the national election is generally conceded to have told us something about the collapse of liberalism as we have known it during the past half century. There are those who A, insist the pieces can be picked up and reassembled, B, those who feel we should be grown up about the collapse of liberalism and move to the realism of conservative policies, and C, those who believe we should push out to the left. We have no representative here today of the first point of view to argue that Humpty Dumpty could be put together again, and accordingly, we will ventilate the other two alternatives. Emmett Terrell's new book is called, appropriately, The Liberal Crack-Up. Mr. Terrell has been designated by no less authority on the subject than Tom Wolfe as, quote, the funniest political essayist to come along in years. The book is funny, but also seeks to be lethal, chronicling the disintegration of liberal illusions. Mr. Terrell is the editor of the American Spectator, the conservative monthly, published out of Bloomington, Indiana. Bob Terrell is a graduate of the University of Indiana, where he also took an MA in 1967. He founded in 1970 the journal then called The Alternative, now The Spectator. He is the author of Public Nuisances and a syndicated columnist who appears regularly in the Washington Post, a singular achievement. Christopher Hitchens, representing the left, was born in England, went to the Lay School in Cambridge and to Balliol in Oxford. During the 70s, he wrote for the New Statesman. Since 1981. He has served as the Washington columnist for The Nation, as also for the London Spectator. I'd like to begin by asking Mr. Tyrrell whether he interprets the events of last November as signifying in any way a conscious national retreat from liberalism.
Well, you know, the Carter administration, in my opinion, showed that liberalism could no longer run a country. And the Mondale campaign of this past fall indicates to me that you can't even run a campaign on liberalism. It's almost unthinkable. It's almost unthinkable, Bill, that 20 or 30 years ago, there'd be so much ideological pressure on an American on a Democratic candidate that he leaped to choose a third-term congresswoman with such unsavory contacts as the Mulberry Street connection.
Well, you're talking now about the incompetence of a presidency, incompetence of a campaign. But I asked a question a little bit different. Namely, do you see a conscious retreat by people who generate popular enthusiasm for what we think of as liberalism? Or is it simply a reaction to an incompetent campaign?
No, I do. I put it differently. It seems to me the reason I mentioned the campaign was the campaign, there were such ideological pressures on Walter Mondale that he couldn't run an effective campaign. And with respect to a withdrawal from liberalism, I would use an entirely different term. I would say it's a crack up. And as far as the liberalism of the past goes, it's my contention in the liberal crack up that there's a disjunction between the New Deal and the present New Age, the present riot of New Age liberalism, the riot of enthusiasms that are contradictory and idiotic and amusing.
This disjunction is caused by what? A false evolution. The New Deal grew into something called McGovernism, which you're saying is an illicit growth?
No, it was brought on by success. I mean, nothing destroys a political movement more than success. And in the 60s and 70s, the liberals achieved most of the things they set out to achieve, particularly welfare and civil rights. And then were overtaken by a lust for power. They refused to notice that they had indeed achieved these things. And they refused to notice that the problems that were now being faced by the American people were different problems, namely the problem of continued prosperity.
Well, Mr. Hitchens, what are your remarks on the implications of these last two defeats? Do you think it was simply reactive against incompetence, or do you think it actually was a rejection of implied political philosophy?
Well, I never thought I'd hear myself saying this, but I'd like to recall to you a very striking phrase, I thought a rather clever phrase of Norman Podhoretz commenting on the 1980 victory of the Reagan-Bush team, I think in commentary, and saying this is the election that Watergate postponed. Mm-hmm. I thought that was a clever remark. I also thought it was more revealing than it was intended to be. In order to take the line of crack up that Mr. Tyrrell has offered us in his book and elsewhere, you've got to really believe that it was a good thing that George McGovern lost the 1972 election. Now, I think that's quite a hard position to uphold. I don't think that a liberal, like a socialist like myself, or any other kind of radical, can look back and say it's a jolly good thing that Nixon and you won that time. We had McGovern won, would have been spared, as well as Mrs. Kirkpatrick at the United Nations and various other bizarre phenomena in the Democratic Party. We'd have been spared the appalling corruption amounting practically to a coup against the Constitution in Washington. I think we would have been spared the particularly abysmal way that the Vietnam and Cambodia wars ended, and we would have been spared the 1974 near war between Greece and Turkey and the destruction and dismemberment of Cyprus.
Up until now, I've even spared knowledge that we came close to a constitutional coup. Tell me more about it.
Well, in my view, what was at stake at Watergate was not merely, as it were, the right of those at the top or in power line their pockets or appoint their friends, but it was, under especially Attorney General Mitchell, the use, and this I call high corruption, of police and other federal agencies as if they were private property, the use of the IRS, the FBI and the CIA against political opponents, against pluralism, as it were. I mean, a very serious, as it were, configuration of
You may be a little
corruption.
bit behind in your readings on what happens in America. It was Robert Kennedy, for instance, who got the sex tapes on Martin Luther King. It was FDR who engaged in tapes just as fast as the evolution of technology permitted him to do so.
I think
lots of friends Roosevelt got rich.
My withers,
got rich.
My withers, Mr. Buckley, are unwrung. I mean, I never tire of pointing that out in every review of a Kennedy depredation that I do. In fact, I'm on record, I think, this week in the Literary Review about that in the review of the Collier Horowitz book on the Kennedys. Of course, everyone has done it. I'm saying that in Watergate, quantity was turned into quality, that there was an attempt to institutionalize the use of agencies of the state as private political police force. If you don't think that's more serious,
well, I don't
that's
think,
your problem and not mine.
I would think it more seriously it was so, but I think that the FBI was used much more widely by the predecessor of Mr. Nixon for such purposes as you describe as by Nixon. I'm really mildly surprised that you think that Mr. Nixon's political appetite to control others ever reached the limits that L.B. Days did. A position, by the way, which is reiterated by many friends of L.B. Days' political program.
Mr. Buckley, if I was to say to you that the government of Poland is a grand tyranny against its people, and you would say yes, so is Czechoslovakia and so is Hungary. What is the point you're making?
Well, the point I'm making,
you mentioned many enemies. You mentioned other enemies of mine in an attempt to deflect from what must be surely an obvious point, which is that the Nixon victory in 1972, the beginning of what we're asked to hail and be pleased about as a liberal crack-up, was a disaster for the United States.
Yeah. So just to review, as somebody pointed out in the chat, apparently New Deal liberalism achieved all of its objectives in the early '60s, and then they just got decadent because there was nothing left to do.
Yes, this would appear to be the theory. So, I mean, there's something, this debate, by the way, kind of goes off the rails, and Firing Line episodes do this a lot because Buckley's not very good at maintaining the structure and pursues a lot of digressions. So the whole thing is built around this question: is there a liberal crack-up? Is the framing question of the episode. And Emmett Terrell, who has written this book called The Liberal Crack-Up, this episode takes place in, 1980, after the 1984 election? Yeah. And so Mondale has just been crushed. And ostensibly they are here to try and explain why Mondale has been crushed and what's going on in liberalism. So Emmett Terrell is offering what he presents as being a descriptive analysis of this, which is there is a, quote, liberal crack-up. And his theory here is, as you say, liberals got everything, and there's going to be a big debate over what that term means. Got everything they want. They had no idea what to do, and then they forgot about the prosperity of America, and so now we have the conservative right in power because liberals have splintered off through enthusiasm. He talks about enthusiasm a lot. Hitchens has done something interesting here, which is that in response, he's not actually going hard at the descriptive analysis. He sort of flips it to, you notice what he does is he says, well, he says, in order to accept the crack up, you have to believe that it was good that Nixon won in 72. Well, that's not, of course, completely true, but he knows that Terrell does believe that it was good that Nixon won in 72. So even though what Hitchens is saying here is not really responsive to the framing question, which is liberalism falling to pieces? he's doing something rather clever, which is forcing Buckley and Terrell to defend Nixon. And to defend right-wing policy. So he's trying to get it out of the realm of descriptive analysis of the forces affecting liberalism and into hitting them with, well, you must think that this is good. And let's discuss whether this is good. And the other one tiny thing I want to note is this thing we're just in right now where Buckley does the classic thing that conservatives do to leftists not realizing that they're not liberals, where he says, you say that Nixon abused people's rights and through invasive surveillance. What about FDR? What about JFK? And Hitchens says the classic thing that we leftists get to do in that situation is go, I don't like them either.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. So it is funny, actually, just to tie the two together. So I've been, Fred Nando Vila early last year recommended to me Robert Caro's series of books about LBJ, and I've been going through those, and I just got to the point where Johnson has taken over as president after the assassination. And, he's talking about like liberal priorities they might be able to accomplish. And one of those is Harry Truman's national healthcare plan from the 1940s, which, of course, Johnson was not able to do. I mean, he was able to do bits and pieces of it, for, with Medicare for people over 65, but like nothing like a one for everybody, right? So it's just a very small example of the bizarreness of the claim that Terrell's making at the beginning there, that that the whole program was just accomplished already, and then they just didn't know what to do after that. I mean, civil rights, not that you and I think that like that was deficient, right? But they have the end of the legal regime of Jim Crow. I mean, like that was accomplished. But I mean, the idea that everything, the idea that like even the sorts of social welfare programs that were anticipated in like classic New Deal, Fair Deal, Great Society liberalism were accomplished. Never mind robust social democracy, never mind what we want, right? Is just nuts.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't, that makes no sense. And I also think, I get what you're saying, that the point isn't really responsive to Terrell's descriptive claim, but since he is celebrated, the liberal crack up, like that is the beginning of what he's celebrated is that Nixon victory, and 68 and then 72.
Okay, shall we see how this goes?
Yeah, for sure.
Its democracy and for its institutions.
This,
Well,
by the
it was
Or
certainly,
would you, I mean, perhaps you haven't said, Mr. Terrell, would you rather?
it was certainly a disaster for Cambodia, and certainly a disaster for South Vietnam. Unhappily, it was a democratically controlled House and democratically controlled Senate that sealed the coffin lid in that situation. I'm not saying that Caligula is the same as LBJ, and that I have to mention him if I mention Nixon. I was simply isolating your remark that we had evolutionized America into a situation in which we were uniquely menaced, which is anti-historic.
But imagine, by the way, thinking that the presidency of George McGovern would have somehow been a great moment for American public policy and statecraft. I mean, this is the thing about
Yes,
this.
I'm not a praiser of politicians, but I don't find. I think it was yesterday in your column in the Post you referred to the McGovern campaign as a gaudy campaign, which it struck me was a most extraordinary use of words for someone so, as it were, painfully honest and unglamorous.
You didn't think the mob surrounding him was gaudy?
No, I certainly did not. I mean, who on earth do you have in mind? Thomas Eagleton?
The whole. Well, it was rather bizarre.
Spectacular.
That was
You
a
might say
bizarre
he was a
moment.
spectacular person. I think Gaudy would be pushing it a little. I just think people should be.
You thought those people were kind of Brooks Brothers?
Should accept the logical and probable consequences of what they say. what you say is it was a good thing. What you must believe is it was a good thing that Nixon and Agnew won that election.
Oh, God,
I say
yes.
that's the root, that is the root problem with.
As a matter of fact, I
With
tend to be more with you, but for reasons that will leave you unsmiling. Namely, that
I expect no less.
I would much rather have had McGovern be there when we let down our allies in Southeast Asia than to have had Nixon do it. Nixon's preoccupation with Watergate did two things. Number one, it preoccupied. Number two, it weakened executive power so that Congress was able to do that which it most probably could not have done under the circumstances. As I say, I would rather McGovern had presided over those 4 years than Nixon.
But actually, you unfortunately, you fail of your effect. Your answer does make me smile, because you haven't got the point that Watergate was the nemesis of a system of lying and deceit that originated in the need to lie about the war in Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia. That was what necessitated the making of lying and deceit and the destabilization of opponents.
I'd have thought it was original
into an institutional.
In the first place, the principal lie, if we got to taxonomize it, you're saying, dates back to Gulf of Tonkin, which had nothing to do with the Republican administration. Which was accepted by the Senate with only 2 dissenting votes, and which was proclaimed by Lyndon Johnson. So that if...
Why do you feel this somehow negates what I say, the fact that it was a Democratic president?
Well, I don't doubt, Mr. Hitchens, that you don't like the American system. You're perfectly free to despise it. I don't like you to say, simply conveniently, that which you don't like is exclusively associated with Republican presidents, that's all.
I made no such... allegation. We're discussing.
You're talking about the unique dangers of the Watergate era.
We're discussing liberalism. I made the citation of George McGovern. It seems to me that by saying of George McGovern, he isn't Lyndon Johnson, one sticking to the truth, and to say Lyndon Johnson is a liberal is stretching it even further.
He's much worse than Lyndon Johnson. Anybody who had voted for Henry Wallace and refuses to apologize for it 25 years later is saying the fact that he was perfectly comfortable with Stalinist policies and with conciliation towards Stalinism in Europe. And George McGovern, who's a friend of mine, simply declines to apologize for the equivalent of voting for Hitler in 1932.
Well, there may be loyalty tests you can set that he can't pass, but I still think that to mention him.
Okay, just want to make sure I'm clear on that last part. We could go on, but I think that what just happened was that Hitchens denied that LBJ was even particularly liberal, and then I think Buckley's response to that was to say, well, LBJ was a strong supporter of the Roosevelt-Wallace ticket, and Wallace was a.
He's talking about McGovern there.
Oh, he's talking about McGovern. Okay. Oh, okay, that makes more sense. Okay, so McGovern. All right, because I was trying to think, was the idea that
McGovern won't apologize for his vote for Henry Wallace.
Okay, there we go. So. Okay, yeah. For a second, I thought he was making like a 10% crazier claim, which would be that like anybody who just supported Roosevelt when Wallace was the vice president was guilty of this. But his claim was that when Wallace runs for president in 1948 for the People's Party, as by the way, the only candidate who refused to speak in front of segregated crowds, advocating, whatever. I think spiritually that was, a lot of ways like predecessor of like a Bernie campaign, but because the communists were supporting Wallace and were like, and were important to the coalition that was supporting Wallace, that therefore, as a unrepentant Wallace supporter, George McGovern, was pretty much a Stalinist, which is as bad as being a fascist. That's the argument.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay.
Oh. Yeah, he says it's the equivalent of voting for Hitler in 1932, and so, but we saw a little bit more of the attempt to tie Hitchens to Democrats that he won't defend, and but I think Hitchens might make a misstep here in this whole LBJ wasn't that liberal stuff, because
Mm-hmm.
the problem with this word liberal is, in some ways, LBJ is, to a leftist, the very embodiment of liberalism, the very thing that we oppose, the very thing that illustrates the limits of liberalism. But instead, he's adopting the kind of framework that says, well, what is it? The Facebook spectrum of political views that you could choose, where you're
yeah, exactly. There's liberal, very liberal. Yes. No, I think that's exactly right. And it's also like, I mean, even in conventional terms, it's really unclear to me, like, what we're talking about, because I think Johnson, like, certainly a Senate majority leader, was an enemy of the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, but like as president, like he did, he did do pretty much the things that liberals wanted. He also committed genocide in Vietnam, which, but as you say, that it goes to the limitations of liberalism. All right. Well, I just wanted to check to make sure I understood that. I will just say before we go on, let me just go all like, informal logic constructor for just a second and say that, like, when you're looking at an argument by analogy, you need to ask, what are the relevant analogies between these two things, and how strong are they? And what are the relevant disanalogies between these two things, and how strong are they? And so I'd say perhaps one relevant disanalogy between voting for Henry Wallace in 1972, or sorry, voting for Henry Wallace in 1948 and voting for Hitler in 1932 is that Henry Wallace was a social democrat who wanted peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union, and did not, in fact, start a world war or set up extermination camps, which are things that seem like relevant disanalogies to me between Henry Wallace and Hitler. But that's just me. Anyway, we can go on.
And Lyndon Johnson, in the same breath, say they're both Democrats, which means that they're almost liberals, and therefore that proves it, is worse than the ahistorical that you accused me of. Well, I thought we were sticking to liberalism.
They both call themselves liberals.
How can we stick to liberalism how can we even discuss liberalism with you if you won't accept that George McGovern was a liberal? I mean, that LBJ was a liberal.
I'm claiming that.
I mean, we have a real problem here. We should have a Bircher here too, because you two, with your extreme views of politics in this country, could get along perfectly.
No, but I think it's helpful that you claim Johnson's a liberal, because I think it shows what the essential category mistake of your book is. That a liberal is someone who you call a liberal, and the elasticity of your definition allows you to have a fair old romp.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you can find,
in one of his books, John Dewey, some patient scholar discovered, used the word liberal to mean 23 different things, and it's true about the elasticity of the word. After all, there wasn't all that long ago that Woodrow Wilson said the history of liberalism is the history of man's efforts to restrain the growth of government. So we acknowledge, but as liberal is used, let's say an ADA liberal is something both of them would have designated themselves as being. How's that?
Well, Johnson and the ADA were not pals.
Oh, for God's sake, Johnson.
No. The ADA opposed Johnson back when he was thought of as being a Southern regenerate. They were wildly enthusiastic about him ever since. The president of the ADA, John Kenneth Galbraith, as recently as 2 weeks ago, said that LBJ was a great saint of liberalism, unfortunately tainted by the commitment to the Vietnamese War.
Well, that's
like
saying, as Hemingway said about your aunt, if she had cojones, would be your uncle. I mean, you can't, as it were.
Now, wait a minute.
Abstract.
Now, in
Vietnam from it.
Okay, in that case, John F. Kennedy is not a liberal, since it was he who very much encouraged those alliances which we pursued. It was John F. Kennedy who made the initial commitment to Vietnam, pursuant to liberal policies which were born, called the arsenal of democracy, and which suddenly is called the military-industrial complex.
Quite. Now, that's helpful, I think, because that gets us nearer to the book, which I'm as anxious to plug as Mr. Terrell is. His book is an attack on the left, with which I am prepared to associate myself. And I think we may have, though this may have been intensely boring for everyone to watch, I think we've cleared the ground in a sense. I mean, he's not really attacking Lyndon Johnson in this book. He's attacking the left.
Yes, he is attacking Lyndon Johnson.
He's attacking the left that survived and came out of the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and the
Well, you
movement
see
against
that.
the Vietnam War.
You say it, Mr. Terrell, who you're attacking.
Well, I mean, I don't see. I'm a much more peaceful man than you are, Christopher. I'm not attacking anyone. I'm merely describing what happened in the 1970s, and what happened in the 1970s was the breakdown of American liberalism into a riot of enthusiasms. And if you would like to read, perhaps we have some organ music. Bill, did you bring your harpsichord? Christopher's about to read.
I don't.
Harpsichord makes very poor organ music.
I don't think. I don't think that peaceful. Peaceful isn't a word I'm in search of. But if you say you don't attack anyone, how come that you say the vast majority of feminists were disagreeable misanthropes, horrible to behold, uncouth and unlovely? They were inferior women, contemptuous of the superior women, who through the charm and intellect of self have been able to establish such enviable lives for themselves. I could go on. I will if you like.
Go on, beautiful.
Why don't you play your own book? I would say that was critical.
I would say that was
use
in
of
my
language.
opinion,
You
a
would just be
clinical
flirtatious
description.
there, weren't you?
Not elegant, but certainly not
I'm
peaceful.
just trying to point out I know the difference between agreeable women and disagreeable women.
Well, yes, you have a number of roguish asides about yourself on this point, but you have a certain want of gallantry when you discuss the women's movement in general. One that I'm surprised in someone who is so fond of conservative affectations about the
Here we
good
are,
old
Bill.
stylish days.
Here we are again.
Wait, Mr. Why you actually say that you don't attack people? Because you do.
Well, I just would like to make one point here. This man has lived on terminological inexactitude. He's lived on the misnomers that came out of the 1970s because these misnomers make it easier for him to make the ideological points he wants to make. For instance, he just referred to the women's movement. And I suspect he doesn't blanch when he sees the New York Times refer to National Organization for Women representing the women's movement. But what of course, to be precise, the women's movement is a misnomer. It refers to some women's movement, those women being
Or the feminists.
feminists. I mean, there is no such thing in this country as the women's movement. It doesn't in any way represent the women I associate with. The feminists don't in any way represent the happy-go-lucky women I associate with. And it doesn't represent the views of all those who voted for Ronald Reagan.
I'm sure that's true too.
So in other words, we got you again, didn't
And
we?
I'm sure a woman would have to. I'm sure a woman would have to be. I don't feel any sort of pain in my ribs. Perhaps I should have noticed.
He began by saying you were insensate.
I know a rapier when I see one, and I know when I've been pronged.
Yeah, but
No, I'm sure, and I'm quite happy to grant you that a woman would have to be happy-go-lucky to associate with you. But if I said the women's movement, I don't say that I don't recognize women as a sect, as well as a movement too. Terminological inexactitude is not what you meant to say, is it?
it's exactly what you. It's exactly what
It's a
you.
euphemism for what you intended to say.
No,
You
no,
want to call me a liar?
No, I wouldn't call you a liar because I believe you
Well,
are.
you know the provenance of- you know the provenance of the
totally
term.
deluded.
You understand the
not gonna
provenance
call
of
you
the
a liar.
term?
No, I'm not going to call you a liar. I believe that you really and truly do believe these things. I've seen your performance in the nation.
I'll state my position if it's of any help to anyone. I wasn't living in America at the time, but I believe that the American left, American radicals, American liberals, many of them, in starting the civil rights movement for Black Americans, in combating an unjust war in Indochina, and in beginning the emancipation of women, the way we think about sex, changed the way everyone thinks and the way everyone lives far beyond the borders of the United States. It was a tremendous time, and the whole world is in debt to the American left, I'd rather call it, for those three enterprises. Now, it's true that they're all now in rather low water, those movements, but I see no reason to sneer at them now or to forget the grand contribution they made, unsurpassed by any conservative
I think
rival.
sneering is not the right word. I would
Jumping
use,
upon is the right
I would
word for
use
this
I would
book.
use I would use high indignation, and in one of the three you mentioned a moral sense of true shame to have guaranteed, as we did, that we would stand by the South Vietnamese and desert them is something which is plain shameful, not something you sneer about. Now let's take civil rights, because in Mr. Tyrrell's book he talks about how what we used to call liberals indeed insisted on something called equality. Equality of opportunity, and how in Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court of the United States said that it was un-American and indeed unconstitutional to take into account a person's race or color or creed in deciding whether somebody goes to school together. Now, that has evolutionized. It's something called affirmative action and something now called quotas. That is viewed by Mr. Tyrrell and by a lot of liberals who endorsed the civil rights movement at that time, specifically, for instance, by Hubert Humphrey in a famous speech, as something that would never happen. And that is a distortion and, in fact, a return to a kind of racism, however involuted. Do you welcome what we call a distortion?
It's probably the worst. No, it's probably the worst single problem that we have on the left at the moment, because not only is it, as you say, known as or reminds people of quotas. I don't believe quotas is what it comes down to.
I did just want to pause to note that this is happening in 1984, and the Supreme Court ruled that that the use of quotas was unconstitutional in 1978. So whatever Buckley thinks he's objected to now, which I think is just like affirmative action in general, it's certainly not actually quotas.
Well, first I got a tiny little observation, which if this is we have passed over an interesting moment that provides a case study in how to do British understatement. So you'll notice that after reading that incredibly nasty passage from Tyrrell about feminists, Hitchens' description was that it showed a certain want of gallantry, which is a classic bit of understatement. And then there was that little exchange over the phrase terminological inexactitude. What's interesting about that is that this was a case where I think Tyrrell doesn't know where the term comes from. I mean, he's an American, so he means it quite literally. And Hitchens, because the term in Britain is a euphemism is a form of understatement for lie. So it comes from Winston Churchill, who used it in 1906, and it's been used ever since. As the terminological exactitude is what you say. You know, the gentleman displays a certain terminological exactitude means that the gentleman's a fucking liar. And that's the way British people talk, is that they spot a bother as a complete catastrophe, right? And so there's this interesting exchange where Hitchens goes, "You're calling me a liar. Say what you mean." And Tyrrell's like, "I don't know what you're talking about. You were being terminologically inexact." And so I think that Tyrrell does not know the British use of this term, whereas Hitchens only knows the British use of this term and feels he's being more insulted than is intended. Yeah, that's my interpretation of the exchange.
Yeah, no, that could very well be. I will also say about the thing about the women's movement and all that I mean, I think Tyrrell is sort of tried to make a point that, like, the form of the point is something that's often a good one, but I think he's trying to extend it beyond what's at all defensible here. So, like, the general form of the point is, like, essentially the one that Matt Brunig makes about identitarian deference, which is that it's a mistake to basically it's a mistake to treat groups as hive minds, right? That there are it's not that there's a thing that women think in general, or a thing that Black people think in general, or etc. Because, like, within any group, you're going to get wild ideological disagreements, and that's all fair enough. But applying that to saying you can't use the phrase "the women's movement," I think is just silly. Okay, but clearly what's meant by the women's movement here is the movement to give equal rights to women.
Yeah,
like that just seems like a perfectly legitimate. I think everybody understands that that's what it means, right? Not that, like, every single woman supports it, but that the point of that you're talking about a movement that is designed, to do something for women, and that's something you can reasonably refer to as a women's movement, right? A labor movement could be a labor thing without every single worker supporting it.
I'm fine with calling it the women's liberation movement, if that would be more, but it would please Tyrrell more by excluding those women who don't believe in women's liberation. But I like that. Again, Hitchens is nicely, you notice that Tyrrell again was trying to sneak back into, now that we've gotten past the frustrating debate over the meaning of the term liberalism, Tyrrell's trying to sneak back into I'm making descriptive claims. And Hitchens does a thing in this debate which I think is useful, which is to say, okay, well, let's look at the three big movements of to come out of the 60s: the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the anti-war movement. All of those. So Hitchens says, now I'm on the territory where I, as a leftist, will defend those movements as being good for the country. And let's talk about whether those were good. And Buckley, of course, goes into, well, you think betraying the people of South Vietnam was good, and Terrell's giving not all women support the movement. We're on sort of more substantive territory than less frustrating the terminological debates now, because Hitchens has brought this question of whether there is a liberal crack up, the framing question of the debate, to okay, well, let's force the conservatives to say what they think of the anti-war movement, the feminist movement, and the civil rights movement.
No, I think that's exactly right. I would also add, it's a I'm happy that we moved on for that, because I actually agreed with William F. Buckley about that part. That because it is actually absolutely true that instead of Buckley is just right that instead of saying that LBJ wasn't a liberal because he was a because he was enough of a Cold Warrior and escalated Vietnam and all of that, instead the correct thing to say is that LBJ is a very liberal president doing that tells you something about liberalism, not that it tells you that he wasn't a liberal.
Yeah.
All right, let's keep going.
It does involve a competition for scarce resources between two constituencies who've normally been on, as it were, our side. That's to say, Jewish Americans and Black Americans. And this has meant that life on our wing of politics has been very tender. I don't believe that simply by legally abolishing discrimination, you have abolished what led to it, the original singling out of Black Americans, the original meaning of discrimination, where they were always mentioned, quoted, counted, and restricted. By saying that now stops, you avoid any responsibility for the past, and you avoid the very tangled question of how we're going to make up for
you're making
the inherited disabilities.
You make a cultural point. If you say art henceforth, it will be perfectly legal, as indeed it should be for blacks to at a restaurant, does not guarantee that every table will have one black and one white patron.
No.
And the point is that any laws that sought to bring that about would be laws which, if one were properly grounded philosophically, one would resist rather fiercely, certainly more fiercely than you have. Now, what about the business of the women's movement? I despise and I'm horrified by the sharp rise in family desertion. And it seems to me that there is abundant evidence to argue that there has been a correlation between the so-called women's movement and the neglect of children and broken homes.
The whole movement, as a matter of fact, has been a terrible failure. A few minutes ago, you talked as though this has been a great success, what's happened to America. The truth of the matter is that a great many kids are, they're called latchkey children, and they live without parents. There's evidence that there's a high incidence of juvenile delinquency associated with these kids that are raised in homes without a father on the scene. And there's also evidence that right within the women's movement that some of these women who 20 years ago were telling the young ladies of America to go out and get careers, careers, not jobs, but careers, are now finding out that no, it didn't come out so well, and that the women ought to go back and establish friendly relations again with the opposite sex, and have children, and live the Ozzie and Harriet life once again. I would feel a little bitter if I were a 45-year-old woman who had given my life over to following dictates of Betty Friedan, and finding out that Betty had decided that on second thought, perhaps the women of America ought to go back, these 45-year-old women ought to go back and become mothers again.
There's a very good book with a title in some ways similar to yours, much better book, by George Dangerfield. It's called The Strange Death of Liberal England. It's a wonderful book. You may have read it. It's A.J.P. Taylor's favorite book. That may not commend it. That may not commend it.
You just live in a world full of kooks.
I mention it. You're very sweet to say so. I mention it for this reason. it's a wonderful evolution of pre-First World War Britain, when the old system, which was basically a liberal one, came under tremendous shocks from the movement for women's suffrage, the movement to disengage from Ireland, and the rise of organized labor. And in the chapter on the rise of women's suffrage, he describes beautifully all the morbid symptoms that appear when a long repressed, especially a sexually repressed group, begin to take their own measure. The suffragette movement, simply for women's franchise, for the right of women to vote, was attacked by all kinds of people for its weirdness, for the way that women started to dress as men, to neglect their families, to behave promiscuously. And many indeed of these symptoms, up to and including suicide on some occasions, were indeed present. But when the air cleared, one could see that that was the result of the original repression. And when you say that women are now, as it were, looking for better relations with the people with whom they broke off when they had to, you're making my point.
Sex.
That's a phase through which that movement had to pass.
You
if
believe,
you read, for instance,
you
Barbara
believe American
Ehrenreich's,
women were repressed throughout the century?
If you read Barbara Ehrenreich's wonderful book, The Hearts of Men, socialist feminist book, you'll see, which calls for, now that we have more term equality, she said, with which to negotiate, let's make a deal with the men. Half our children are going to be boys.
You don't understand.
We can't get along without them. Men and women get married, as she wittily points out, exactly the same numbers. Let's do it, but let's do it now, because now we're going to be taken more seriously.
You don't understand that
Perfectly
throughout this
straightforward.
century here in America, with the exception of Black people, particularly in the South, that this has been a free society, do you? I mean, you think the Women's Christian Temperance Union, for instance, to mention one of the repressive movements that rose up and disappeared in this country, you don't believe that was dominated and run by women, do you? You think it was probably run by men, probably Buckley, the Buckley family.
I know there's a joke that I've missed.
No.
I'm
the joke. Had you read the book, you'd know it.
Read it with prepared to quote from it again.
You'd know that the Women's Christian Temperance Union had enormous amount of political power in this supposed country that you feel repressed women in the first part of the century.
Or as you so brightly say, feminist demands are a horse laugh. The average American woman has actually controlled two bodies and sometimes more, usually by employing only one or two parts of her own.
Pretty good, eh?
I'm so glad I didn't write it myself. The fact is, for your position to be even humorous, you'd have to say that all the women who felt themselves excluded from large parts of American life, underpaid or undervalued or underregarded, or in other ways taken for granted, were making it all up, that it was just a spree of neurosis. Going on. That must be what you believe. In fact, I think it's pretty evident that you do.
Now, let me talk about something else that you said. You suggested that inevitably post-emancipation there is a period of exorbitant behavior, and one oughtn't to be surprised by this. And there's a certain sense in which what you say is not impossible to validate historically. When the Latin Americans fought to free themselves from foreign tyrant, they submitted to their own tyrant. Exactly the same thing has happened in Africa. We've taken a long, deep breath. 150 years have gone by, and a few nations in Latin America flirting with democracy. It hasn't quite happened substantially in Africa, but maybe it will in due course. It's certainly true that the whole notion that there would have to be oppression from the center after socialist revolution tended for a long time to immunize Stalin, and before that Lenin, from the kind of criticisms which they had so abundantly earned. I maintain, however, that even if you are making a sociologically interesting point, what you are by no means doing is justifying any cessation of criticism during this interval. That is to say, if you do have a Colonel Idi Amin in exchange for the predecessor colonial power, the fact that you say, well, this kind of thing is going to happen before it involves a democracy does not say, therefore, you shouldn't be indignant about it or oppose it. And Mr. Terrell's thesis really is that let us indeed hope that some of the extremist feminists go back and behave and worry about things like families. But why can't we hasten that repatriation by sensible criticism?
Well, I don't think it was sensible criticism that I was just citing. I have no quarrel with your
language.
quarrel with your methodology at all. But in fact, Mr. Terrell is saying, just did say, that he thinks the whole thing was just a spree. It was all made up. It was promiscuity and exorbitance for its own sake. That there was nothing that they had nothing to complain about. Now, your point, I think, is much more challenging for me because you raised the whole question of emancipation and at what cost it comes in at, and you mentioned Amin,
is there a
and
necessary
you could have
adolescent
mentioned-
phase?
Yeah, the position we on the left keep finding ourselves in is the victims of a sort of three-card trick. We take the example of, say, Iran, which Mr. Turiel dwells upon quite a lot. We said for a long time it was a mistake for the United States to overthrow the government of Iran in 1954, a crime, in fact, and a mistake to impose the Shah. We said if you keep the Shah in power, it won't work. He's a failure, a real tyrant, and there will be hell to pay. When the hell to pay actually comes and we're proved right, the chaos turns on everybody. And who's identified as the wrong person to have been? We are, for having told you. And we're supposed to take the blame for the collapse of what we always opposed.
But this
is the three-card trick that's played throughout this book, and it's played, very widely at the moment by the Reagan
He believes
campaign.
in a world without problems. He's an ideologue, and he has this set. You're an ideologue. You have this set of ideas here before you. This set of ideological desiderata before you, and you believe that if we live up to these desiderata, everything will be all right. There won't be problems. There won't be difficulties in government in Iran. There won't be difficulties in South America. There won't be difficulties between a man and a woman. I see now how the ideological mind has a utopian cast to it.
I'll let the viewers be the judge of whether I sound as if I believe any of that.
Well, the difficulty with integrating your analysis is that you assume, in the first place, one should never use mistake and crime as a coterminous in situations, in political situations. Crime involves a mens rea, and there was no mens rea that I can think of.
Yeah, it was just a mistake. That there was one day, Uncle Sam was distracted and daydreaming and accidentally tripped over a rock and fell into supporting the Shah and stalling him.
Yes. We've passed through some of my favorite moments in this, including Hitchens' brutal disses of Emmett Terrell's book. Such as there's another book, a much better book, called The Strange Death in Liberal England, and and his other phrase, which was "I'm so glad I didn't write it," which I enjoyed. And the other line I liked from him is "I'll let the viewers decide whether I sound as if I believe any of that you just said. I don't have time." But so, the structure of what we've just seen, right, is that essentially Terrell is making the case that the social movements of the 60s, maybe with the exception of the civil rights movement a little bit, had nothing to complain about. Right. He says directly to Hitchens, America is and has always been, with the exception of black people, which the commenter pointed out was quite an exception, a free country. And he cites the fact that the Women's Christian Temperance Union had political influence as his definitive proof of this. And so this is the kind of so. That's the Terrell point, and then the Buckley point that comes in here is the what we talked about at the beginning of the episode, which is we get to this question of, okay, well, because Hitchens says, well, okay, but you may cite problems. He says to Terrell, you may cite problems with the that come out of these movements, but I've written a long article about riots. The conservative attack on riots, and the point that you can't just look at the riot and go look at the way that social protest has developed. You have to look at the repressive conditions that bred it, and this is the thing that that Hitchens is pointing out, is that you may identify things that come out of the women's movement, like the breakdown in relations between the genders, but where are those coming from? Why is there a women's movement to begin with? At which point, Buckley comes in with the classic conservative statement of, well, what you're saying is that it may very well be the case that the repression is not as bad as the thing that comes out after it, and that and he's essentially justifying colonialism, right? Because he says, well, if colonialism is followed by Idi Amin, then that doesn't justify Idi Amin, and so this is kind of where we're at. And then they get into this debate about Iran and Mossadegh and the Shah, and but we've come in on the kind of classic left statement that movements and even movements' excesses are justified or at least explicable as a response to hideous oppression, and the conservative argument that actually all of those things are worse than what came before.
I would also, it's a very, very small thing, but at the very end there, Buckley drawing about mens rea is just a classic instance of the kind of bullshit affect of Buckley and Buckley style conservatives, because he sounds so laconic and confident, and he's using Latin, right?
Latin on you, yeah.
Yeah, but that just means intent. And yes, I do think, in fact, that when the United States overthrew the democratically elected, president of Iran and installed the Shah in the first place, I do think that action happened with intent. I don't think there's any way that's just sort of like accidentally, without meaning to, overthrow a government on the other side of the world and impose a brutal dictatorship.
Well, this also comes up in Buckley's debate with Chomsky. This is a big part of Buckley's defense of the U.S. imperialism. We have good motives. We don't commit crimes because we mean well. And Chomsky in that debate says, well, every imperialist power has stories that it tells itself that justify its behavior. Nobody thinks of themselves as evil. And that leads to one of the best exchanges in that debate, which is Chomsky saying, with some exceptions. And Buckley goes, well, let's talk about the exceptions. And Chomsky goes, no, the exceptions are cases like the Belgians in the Congo, where they didn't even pretend that they were trying to do anything to help the people that they were brutally exploiting. And so, but he says that, they're always exploiting people and they're always telling some story about why they're good. But Buckley really heavily emphasizes in that debate and in this one, the lack of malicious intent on behalf of, on the part of America.
Yeah. And it is interesting too, because that sits really awkwardly with two other things that Buckley and people who share his ideology seem to have believed, right? Which are, one, that the American cause of the Cold War was absolutely just, and two, that the left is forever doing things with with good intentions and just accidentally hurting the very people we intend to help, et cetera, right? And okay, so why don't the communists in the Cold War get credit for good intentions? Is there surely the case for ideological sincerity there is like at least as good as as like whatever horseshit LBJ and Nixon are saying to justify napalming rice fields in South Vietnam.
Indeed.
I would think. But yeah, this is also I love that in that little exchange about the women's movement and the bad effects of real or alleged bad effects of it, and whether even if those are bad effects, whether that's the responsibility of the original repression or the or the response to the repression, that Hitchens had just read a passage that would have embarrassed a 19-year-old like college Republican like trying his hand as like a shock jock on the college radio station. And after that, Buckley says like, well, look, I mean, you know, why isn't Terrell right that, you know, given that these bad incidents happen, that, you know, that like reasonable criticism is appropriate. You know, it's like, so we're just going to pretend that that was reasonable criticism.
Yeah. And I love the way, I mean, we didn't dwell on that great moment where Terrell, from earlier, where Terrell's like, I don't attack anyone. And Hitchens goes, well, I'm going to read a passage from your book. And Terrell gets a little nervous then, and he starts going, oh, we're going to have some music? Oh, Hitchens is going to read. And then he reads that just hideous, disgusting thing about how feminists are like ugly and unlovable. And even Buckley goes, why'd you say you don't attack people? Of course you attack people. Why don't you defend attacking people? But it's a beautiful example of why you should always have the person's text there in front of you so that you can read it when they make some ridiculous, unsupportable claim like, I don't attack people.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's keep going.
In attempting to remove Mossadegh, who was a self-proclaimed dictator. Now, you are also asking us to believe that if in 1954 Mossadegh had taken over, the age of Khomeini would never have come. Well, presumably not. But this doesn't argue that the removal of Mossadegh was not at that time the judicious thing to do. And it certainly brought 30 years or 25 years of relative progress in Iran by your standards. That is to say, attempts to give more hospitals, more schooling, more literacy, more what we call...
What about the women?
Well, first,
what about women?
First, we're familiar with the joke expression, worse than a crime, a mistake. I mean, I'm sorry if I was conflating the two. I think mistake would be euphemism, crime might be an overstatement. Let's say anyway, historic blunder. Note the irony. If you read the memoirs of those Kermit Roosevelt, the CIA, and Mr. Woodhouse of British intelligence, who organized the overthrow of Mossadegh, you'll notice that their main allies in the overthrow of the Iranian left and center left were the mullahs, that it was the mobs of backward fanatics and religious leadership who were employed to do that job, and who were given a larger role in Iran in the first place. The Shah continually compromised with them too. Indeed, though he blasphemed by calling himself one of his own titles the shadow of God, he certainly posed always as the defender of Shia Islam. Shia Islam is not a new political phenomenon in Iran just because it was only discovered by the newspapers when the Shah was collapsing. I'd still like to reiterate my grievance, if you don't think I'm sounding plaintive. It's that now we're attacked because it's all gone wrong in Iran and life there is hell. And there's a filthy theocratic dictatorship where for some reason they can't seem to separate religion and politics. And I've no doubt there's mandatory school prayer. We who warned that this would happen if it went on under the despotism of the Shah are now blamed for it and made to carry the can.
Well, you are blamed in the sense that you were the point man at a critical period during which we forced the Shah to behave in a way that proved suicidal. You don't, when a regime is tottering, urge that particular moment for amnesty for political prisoners. It doesn't make much sense, does it?
No, I've been calling that amnesty from long before. I wouldn't stop calling for it just because the regime was tottering.
Bill,
I mean, you'd be asking me to do the impossible.
Well, it depends on whether you have the clairvoyance to see what the immediate alternatives are. Unhappily, Mr. Carter did not, right?
Well, if you had clairvoyance, you wouldn't be in that position in the first place. So I think there's an undistributed middle in your logic.
No, wait a minute. I'm careful about undistributed middles. If there were the foresight, if you prefer, to see to it that there wasn't a third alternative waiting in the wings in Iran. There was going to be either this madman or the Tsar, the Shah, who in fact was rather liberal oriented as these people go. If you knew that there was no third alternative, one ought not to have hesitated to back the Shah. That's not an ideological position, and certainly one with which I should think, given that you so convincingly deplore the excesses of the Ayatollah, for instance, school prayer, that you would agree with me about this.
I'm prepared to leave you occupying the position that that the Shah could have been saved, because you'd rather say could, I suspect, in your best moments, you'd rather say could than should have been saved. But note that you're putting the worst case straight away. I'm asked
sure
to,
that-
I'm asked to say,
certainly
what do you
shouldn't
do
could.
when a man has plunged you into a position where he says it's either me or barbarism? I would say you'd have to ask, who is this guy that he's led us to that choice?
You're making
And that
mark.
is the same mistake as you made with Somoza, and as you have made with El Salvador, and in the process of making in the Philippines. And again, I can tell who's going to be blamed when it goes wrong. The people who never thought Somoza or Marcos was a good bet in the first place are going to be blamed. We're going to be told we lost the Philippines.
Yeah, but actually you haven't. You've got such magnificent control of the public forums that you haven't been blamed for anything. So don't worry about it. I find it more interesting, if I might.
Doesn't feel like that, but I mean,
I know you got this terrible sense that everybody's ganging. And this. By the way, I'm very uncomfortable. You know, we outnumber Christopher 2-1 here, and disagree with him. I'd like to try to agree with him on something, just to to be kind of chummy and not to look at, because it's very unusual for you, who have spent 30 years of public life being outnumbered by the media in this country, and I who've spent 45 years of public life, being your senior.
You did a good day at 40.
To kind of gang up on poor Christopher. But can we return to America? Because I think it's very interesting.
We're through with Iran.
Well, if we could, I mean, because
It's you who raises it in your book. It's not me.
factually, one of the big problems in Iran, of course, was that Iran had a very small middle class, and it's very hard to have democratic politics in a huge country like that with a tiny middle class, and the huge number of backward people that you had all allegiance to, or owing allegiance, or owing their affinities to the mullahs. I mean, that basically your problem isn't ideological. There was a problem of practical politics.
Let me ask a question unsarcastically. What percentage of Great Britain was middle class, say, in 1830?
In 1830?
Yeah. Would you say as high as 15, buddy?
Well, it's difficult to gauge, because that's before the Reform Bill, when it was decided on what basis one was middle class enough to be allowed to vote.
But it would be around that, wouldn't it? The reason I point that out is that this was a period when England did not allow votes to women, to Jews, or to Catholics. And yet history isn't as harsh on George IV as we are urged to be on the Shah of Iran, where far, far fewer than 25% of the Iranians were members of the middle class. So that gives us perhaps a useful historical perspective. Go ahead.
I never thought of him as George IV before, I must say.
Christopher, you're an unusual creature in American life, in that you are so rigidly ideological. And this is, by the way, something I blame you Europeans for bringing over to our shores, is this ideological cast of mind, which I believe.
We got a few homegrown ideologues.
Well, it's always, I know we do, and it's unfortunate that we do, but nonetheless, I think it owes itself to European politics, and the European criticism of America has often been that we aren't ideological enough. But, one of the things that I think, points I make in the liberal crack-up, is that it's an ideological cast of mind that leads to the kind of enthusiasm and irrational enthusiasm that you see making the liberal wing of the Democratic Party such an unmanageable menagerie today.
Well,
it's not. By the way, for instance, the New Deal under Roosevelt was not nearly so ideological as the present Democratic Party. And I might point out a point that I like to make in this book, is that there is no line in logic or in policy, no direct line from the New Deal to the present gaggle of enthusiasts.
I'm not so sure I agree with you.
I figured that we did.
Because
See, I wanted to.
a lot of critics of the New Deal said what we have opened the doors to is the kind of thing that is now happening. And as a matter of fact, if you measure the distance between, let's say, the vector of Roosevelt's policies and those of Calvin Coolidge, you would probably find that distance much, much greater than the distance between Roosevelt's and LBJ's.
Oh, I don't know.
Well, the Communist Party at the time, at one stage, were called the New Deal fascism. And many leading American business organizations said that Roosevelt was at least socialist, if not worse.
Yeah.
And I suppose that might be the measure of how non-ideological it was. I mean, I've now been told I have to stick up for the position of intolerance and ideological rigidity, and that I've imported it to the United States,
that way, though. You
which
are.
I think could
It's
probably
just-
have acquired it without me. But I did begin, I'll just remind you, I began by saying that when I still lived in England, before I became an immigrant, I was, as many, many millions of people were, very inspired by the American examples, in particular Dr. King, but also later the movement to arrest the unjust war in Indochina.
What about
and
Jefferson and
as I
Madison?
say, it was American women who really began to show women in the advanced countries that they needn't live on the assumptions that dictated their lives up till then. These were the examples that stirred me, and that I'm inclined to
Well,
defend.
there you are again. I mean, there you go again. You're in favor of the trouble with the ideological cast of mind that you exhibit here is one of the problems is that it tends to politicize more and more areas of American life. I contend that men and women never had to be politicized on the grounds of sex.
Because remember, the women's Christian temperance movement exercised political influence, so that settles that. I mean, there's no, there's nothing. How could there have been legitimate complaints about the legal or cultural status of women at a time when there was a women's organization that was politically influential?
This debate is a bit of a mess, as we can see. I mean, we drifted kind of far afield from the question from the supposed framing question of whether there is, quote, a liberal crack up when we got into the situation with the legitimacy and wisdom of overthrowing the Shah, or of overthrowing Mossadegh and installing the Shah. And I wanted you to, at some point in there, they had a debate over whether or not Buckley had committed the logical fallacy of the undistributed middle, which I wanted to resolve.
I'm afraid I have no idea what Hitchens was saying was an example of, I mean, for people who aren't familiar, undistributed middle is where you have a categorical syllogism, which is just an argument that's about relationships between categories. There's all dogs are mammals, all mammals are animals, all dogs are animals. But like it's one where the middle term isn't distributed, meaning that like you have like all dogs are mammals, all cats are mammals, therefore all cats are dogs. That's the fallacy. As I heard him say that, I have to admit I was a little unclear about what it was that he was saying committed that. I definitely missed a beat there somewhere.
Yeah, me too. Buckley's response is great. He says, "I'm very careful about distributing my middles." Very indignant at being accused of a lapse in formal logic.
Nice. But it is amazing though. Like, I mean, I guess in a way, I mean, it is kind of like the, Natalie Wood point about the timelessness of Peterson's defensive hierarchy. Like, what I really wish that Terrell will be challenged on right now at this moment where we paused, I mean, we'll see if he is, but is at what time do you think it was true that there was no particular problem about the status of women in American society? Like what's the, like ever, right? Like lacking the right to vote was fine, right? Or is there, because he's saying, well, this should never have been, men and women, that should have never been politicized. So, like, I mean,
women politicized this. Everything was fine, but the ladies had to get all political about it. It appears to be his perspective. It's kind of a shame actually having Emmett Terrell on to talk with Hitchens, because he's such a buffoon. Like he is, as you said, like various points, like 19-year-old trying to say outrageous things level. He's not very intellectually serious. I mean, even Buckley has contempt for him at certain points. And now he's going into this whole like you imported ideology from Europe thing. You know, you come over here, you European with your ideology, and it's very very straight. I mean, I would like him to be asked like, what is ideology and how do you know that you don't have an ideology? But you know, he just believes in these weird stereotypes where Americans are pragmatic people who don't have fixed ideologies, and Europeans have these political parties and they and these fixed notions, and you know, he doesn't defend any of it. Of course, Christopher Hitchens is the wrong person to be accusing of that, because Hitchens is you know, is one of the most kind of shape-shifting.
Right,
he's like not a particularly ideologically rigid guy at all in terms of being able to be pinned down to a very particular fixed set of ideas that he's associated with.
Yeah, I mean, I will. Right, I mean, given the overall course of his life, I mean, I will say that in this period, he did. You know, he had remained much more consistent with the things that, you know, that he was saying earlier in his life. In fact, 2 years after this debate, he wrote an essay called "Blunt Instruments," which has in it actually my favorite defense of what I guess Kurt Terrell would call ideological rigidity that I've ever read. Which is, he said, let me see, I think I actually quote this in a couple of different books because I like it so much, but he has, oh, come on. Yeah, okay. Well, he has, he says, let's see. Yeah, no, okay. I can't find it. In any case, he says something like, you know, he makes fun of how the people will use knee jerk as an insult. And he says, this is, you know, that I don't get it, you know, speaking purely for myself. If my knee didn't respond to stimulus, I would be disturbed. You know, it would make me think I'd had a loss of nerve, and then he goes on about how you know, how people, you know, says in the charmed circle of neoliberal and neoconservative journalism, unpredictability is a badge of pride, and he even gives the example. This is very weird and grim in a sort of Ghost of Christmas Future sort of way, given where he ends up. But he gives the example of somebody saying, I'm a liberal, but I still bomb the hell out of them. And he says, well, as a lifelong socialist, I say, let's not bomb the hell out of them. I suppose that lacks the sex appeal.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, and this is also like when he says that about the ideological rigidity. I mean, Buckley even pushes back on that. It's like, really? Right? That's only a European thing. You know, Americans can't have that. And I will also say that Buckley is, in fact, right about something else a minute after that, although he's disagreeing with Terrell, not Hitchens, where Terrell says the New Deal wasn't ideological, but like 1980s liberalism is ideological. And
it's very weird. Is Terrell trying to defend? I think is this because at this point the New Deal was still so uncontroversial? Like, you know, we know that after the New Deal, in retrospect, it was so successful that for an entire generation you couldn't repudiate the New Deal. And at this point, conservatives had to try and find a way to distinguish themselves. So to say, oh, the New Deal, that was fine. I'm not saying the New Deal. I'm not one of those reactionaries who oppose the New Deal. But this new kind of liberalism, this is not Roosevelt. Everyone loves Roosevelt, but this is not Roosevelt. And I feel like this may be, and Buckley's like, well, I detest Roosevelt. but I feel like at this point in time, it was still there were some conservatives who would still go out of their way to try not to attack the incredibly popular New Deal.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think they haven't yet gotten to the point where they would just openly do that. The memory was still a little too fresh. But Buckley is absolutely right that, like, look, if you want to just like talk about sort of ideological departures from previous American political consensus, then yeah, I mean, the New Deal was a much bigger deal than like any of this sort of establishment liberalism that Terrell was whining about in 1984. Because what is he really talking about, right? That like at the Democratic convention, they're going to make sure that there are equal numbers of seats, assigned to men and women in some committee or whatever, right? Like that's presumably the kind of thing he has in mind, right? When he talks about this riot of enthusiasms, he's talking about like just the sort of further development of like various social movements, in sort of mainstream Democratic Party context in the 1980s. I mean, that's a way smaller departure from what had existed before than Franklin Roosevelt fundamentally transforming the role of the state and the economy in ways that did in fact go for the better, but I mean in ways that did in fact totally go against the grain of what had happened before, and allying with a militant labor movement that was engaged in sit-down strikes, and having the while we're talking about social movements, doing the Fair Employment Practices Commission, to try to institute some level of civil rights, at least in federal government context, a little bit, like that was a much bigger deal. It's just that, and so Buckley is absolutely right. I mean, Buckley is being honest about this because like he's just enough of a weird reactionary old coot. He'll just say it in 1984, how much he hated Roosevelt, but Terrell's being weird and evasive about it.
Yeah.
Sexual or gender.
Surely they had to when they weren't allowed to vote. You had to politicize the movement.
Well,
there you go.
There you go. William F. Buckley is actually.
You literally said the thing I want someone to ask him is, and Buckley, who again, I think we have to respect Buckley a little bit in this because he's consistently made better points than Emmett Terrell.
Yes, he has. Yeah. So yeah. All right. Was it when women couldn't vote? Like, was that was insisted on being able to vote when the ladies made it too political? Or was it when like they got to vote that then everything was fine and they were like being unduly political? When like in the 1950s when they wanted to be allowed to open bank accounts, or what was the get rid of the last vestiges of coverture marriage? I mean, like that's inquiring minds want to know. When was the point when it was unreasonable to politicize this?
I'm talking about the present, and what you had, the reason you had what the historic evolution of women in this country was towards greater and greater freedom brought about by two things. One, the birth control pill, and the other by the need to get out and get into the workforce for economic reasons. And there's no reason that and this was going on. I mean,
I know it just started, but I just can't not point out that like talking about the birth control pill as if this is just this neutral technological development that has nothing to do with anybody politicizing anything is ridiculous. I mean, there were many, many laws against the use of birth control, and like there was some pretty bitter political struggle about this. That was the Griswold case, that was the predecessor to Roe v. Wade, was about allowing, legally about stopping states from banning birth control.
I'm beginning to suspect this man does not know what he's talking about.
It does kind of seem that way, doesn't it?
When he answers the question, he goes, "Oh, the present." I'm talking about the present. What do you? Okay, are we still talking about the 60s then? Like, oh well, no, no, I don't want to talk about history anymore because you asked me about history.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's yeah. Again, I have. It's so was 1970 the point when everything was fine and there was no need to inject politics into this.
No, he says that the history of women in this country is a history of moving towards, quote, greater and greater freedom. But then he takes pains to try and find a way to make sure that that is not the result of women's agency or organizing in any way, right? So he lists two things that he says contributed to this greater and greater freedom, which presumably means that they began in a state of oppression, is an implicit acknowledgement of that. But then he says, oh, well, the birth control pill made women more free, and then economic pressures to enter the workforce. So he has to admit, essentially, that women have become more free, but he refuses to admit that that had anything to do with any women's agency.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's it. Just sort of happened. That's it's like how. It's like when we accidentally installed the Shah. That there was somehow or another, without anybody actually having any political, intentionality, to achieve greater freedom. Greater freedom just sort of came about, and then instead of being grateful about it, everybody got stir crazy and political for no reason.
The trend was very clear that more and more women were going into the workforce. And there's no reason to believe that this had to be politicized. Naturally, when they got into the workforce, when they got down to the office, there weren't enough women's restrooms. But you see, the difference between you and me is I say this was a historical evolution, and you say this was an example of conscious repression by the American male, probably white. You probably wrote that.
You say that?
No, I didn't say that. It's not what I meant.
But you would say that you would, if you were given, that you do believe that. No, you already said that you thought women were repressed in this country.
What I'll say I've noticed as a person who is, as you would have noticed, both white and male, is that attitudes of my peer group, other people like me who are white and male, I mean by that, towards women have undergone a vast improvement in the last 15 years or so. I think one of the good things about the civil rights movement was how it improved the moral standards of white people. I think one of the great things about the women's movement, or the feminist movement, if you like, is that it's changed the way that men think.
That's because you're English.
For our sake as well as theirs. That's what is good about reform movements, is they're not what are now called interest groups or selfish, narrow, contained things.
But you see, you needed to be enlightened in your treatment of women because you're from England. And the English, as we all know, have always had a sense of
separatism.
Of separatism. I mean, you
might
very well be a member of an English men's club right now.
Most Americans seem to think that Englishmen take the view that gentlemen prefer gentlemen anyway. I can't argue with that. I mean, I know what our reputation is. It'll take a lot of living down.
Let's not probe that one. But, going back to de Tocqueville pointed out that in this country, women were freer, traveled, given more dignity, more self-assertive than any place else in the world. So we actually have, the truth is, you also have this notion that America has a great deal to be ashamed of. I don't. I think it's a wonderful country, and I'm delighted to live here, and I can see you're happy here now.
I went to more trouble to live here than you did, Mr. Sorrell. You were just born here. I went to all the trouble to cross the Atlantic. I like it well enough to have done that. Of course, the American woman is assertive. If they weren't, they wouldn't have started the feminist movement in the 70s. It took assertive women to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you expect?
But it didn't have
Why
to be
do you
done.
think you've
Of course,
answered
the
me
whole
by
thing
pointing out
didn't have to be
they're
done. My point is, far more venom was exchanged in this advance of women that you talk about. I think it's a mixed blessing, because I think the same for every woman that happily got herself a career, there were 10 mothers made miserable before having to stay home and take care of the kids. And people like you and Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem and then the fanatics out there of course, made life for those mothers raising kids at home all the more miserable, with that awful question that would always be asked at the cocktail party to some perfectly sensible mother: "What do you do? What do you do?" My wife, of course, translates French for the American Spectator, does reviews for the American Spectator, reviews Buckley's books of the American Spectator, and she's too authentic to say,
Too secure.
I'm a
It sounds like
translator for the American Spectator.
chattel slavery to me, your wife's existence, I must say.
Exposed her to wonderful literature, though.
I'm now, for heaven's sake, told that I'm against motherhood too.
Yeah.
I mean,
No, look at you.
where does
See, you have
one,
this
you know-
persecution complex. You have a persecution complex. That's
I'm just
another
wondering if my
problem that
wife
the
is
left
watching
has in
us.
this country. I just told you that in fact, Bill just tried to criticize me for something, so we could let you off the hook. for a
Sure,
while.
I'll give you an example, because I attacked your ungallant use of words about women earlier on. Jean Kirkpatrick, say, or Midge Decter, your great friend, and Jean Kirkpatrick, your great heroine, are people with whom I have really tremendous political disagreements, immense ones, I mean, quite unreconcilable ones. I do not say in my column, the old bitch, the old bag, the old douchebag, the old dog, the old pig. She's only in politics because she's hideous, she can't find a man. I don't say, as you say, of my sisters
Your
on the
sisters.
left, disagreeable misanthropes, horrible to behold, uncouth and unlovely.
Did you see
Now,
douchebag in there?
and they were inferior women.
I didn't see it. Did you hear douchebag, Bill?
Now,
Billingsgate, I will not.
20 years
stoop
ago,
to.
20 years ago or so, there would have been the temptation to say that about a female opponent would have been very strong. And probably a lot of us would have yielded to it. But we men on the left have all become infinitely nicer, more charming,
White,
more stylish, more gallant.
chauvinist
Well,
pig.
than you.
How many times have I
Well,
been called a chauvinist
than
pig?
the conservatives
object-
who say that it's terrible these days, women don't want the door held open for them anymore.
Will you defend me
Real
whenever
nice
I'm
and
called a
tolerant, like
chauvinist
Tony
pig,
Benn.
a chauvinist pig, a Nazi, a fascist, and all that stuff?
No, I
You
know
weren't a
fascist,
part of that.
I know a fascist when I see one.
And
I call him a fascist when I do.
do you see one?
But of course, the problem there is if someone is a
Look me in
fascist,
the eye.
the problem there is if someone is a fascist, it's not an insult. Because if you call a Nazi, you're not being rude to him, are you? So one can waste a lot of breath in this.
Well, I don't know. I think
with
I-
abuse.
Look, the
if you see an ugly woman, you call her ugly. You're certainly being rude.
Depends. It depends.
And I
The
thought that
question
was
of
what you-
timing
one
is
of the points
everything.
you're gonna make, yeah.
Timing is everything. The question is, when do you break it to her that she's ugly?
It depends on your value system too. Maybe she
Well,
admires.
if you're in a clinic, I suppose.
Do you in any way see my point, or am I just being sanctimonious?
Well, yeah, I think you are. I mean, after
Fair
all,
enough.
my point is that in political discourse, you and your sisters, as you put it, in that awfully uncomfortable way, once again suggestive of an ideological cast of mind, you attack me for calling women misanthropes, or feminist misanthropes, but
Horrible to behold, uncouth and unlovely.
Yes, but what about the women on your side who would refer to me as a chauvinist pig, as a matter of course? I mean, that went on all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But
Well, I
you-
mean, I think you obviously
And the
are.
difference
but,
is
Bob,
they're
you-
absolutely serious. They are. See?
Wait a minute, but Bob, you can't cite their misbehavior as authorizing your own.
No, but I don't think that I'm. He said that he talked about my language. First of all, he said I used Billingsgate such as douchebag, and of course, then he went on. There was no such word there. Those words are perfectly
I
acceptable.
didn't say you said it. I was content to quote your own.
Those words are perfectly acceptable. And I see nothing wrong with describing feminists who have been so misanthropic as misanthropes.
In the
However,
age-
I would not. I do think that it takes a certain fight of mind to refer to a person like me as a chauvinist pig. But Christopher just pointed out that it's not. That's exactly what I am.
I've also read your book more carefully than you have. It says, in the new age, all women would be hags. This was the logical imperative of the feminist revolution.
That's right. That's what they want. They wanted to. It's their
And there's
point.
a,
The
there's a
feminist
really,
point.
followed by a really sad abuse of John Mencken's prose. I don't have the right to pray him in aid for a sentence like that. But you see, we don't have to, on the left, go around politicizing things when they
You
already
have
are.
politicized.
No, they already are. We found them that way,
Mm.
and we decided to call it by its right name. I mean, as we sit here, for instance, everyone in this room has been made into a frontline soldier. The nuclear age means that we're all conscripted. We don't have the right to conscientious objection anymore. We are in the front line while the soldiers are in the bunkers, a complete redefinition of the meaning of war and the civilian. That's been done to us whether we like it or not. We can't then complain of those who object to it that they're politicizing the situation. The politicization has been done. We're all conscripted. We might as well be sitting here in uniform.
Well, you sound like one of the
And that conscription was
you
enforced.
sound like some fanatic libertarian who would say the same thing. We have to pay taxes. We've already been conscripted. We've been forced to.
I don't think that's a terribly good comparison.
Good enough.
There's
Well,
a sense,
because they
wait,
haven't
wait,
been
wait,
conscripted.
It's good enough. Yeah.
Stop, everybody stop. There's a sense in which it is true that we live in an age in which 2-3 people can decide on the future of the planet. And therefore, any overtures to those people require a political exertion. It is, however, not true, as Mr. Hitchens seems to want to believe, that it therefore follows as a corollary, that all movements and all relationships are equally politicized for that reason. It's true that there's no significant difference between the man in the trenches and the man in the Park Avenue in terms of apocalyptic exchange. It is not true that a housewife ought to feel that she is a part of an ongoing political movement. And it certainly is true, in my judgment, as Mr. Terrell has argued, that an effort has been made to say to all women, you're not only women, you're not only mothers, you're not only homemakers, you're not only writers, whatever, you are also women qua women. Jesse Jackson gets up and he says, I'm a black man first, I'm an American second. In saying that, he gives an order of priorities, which tells a lot about him, which would have made Martin Luther King shudder, for instance.
Oh yeah, I do love conservative invocations of Martin Luther King, who was way to Jesse Jackson's left, by the way, but whatever.
I also have in the article I wrote about William F. Buckley, I actually talk about his relationship with Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. Essentially, Buckley began as an outright segregationist in 1957, and as the Civil Rights Movement made gains, Buckley found himself having to adjust his position accordingly. So it's interesting that he he says it made Martin Luther King shudder here, but everyone found themselves having to praise King. And there's actually, I have a long excerpt from the address that Buckley gave the day after the assassination of Martin Luther King, or the week after, and it's almost disparaging towards King. It's mostly irrelevant. It's mostly he just can't find anything good to say about Martin Luther King. But it shows how the same as we were talking about with the New Deal, where it became so popular that nobody could criticize it. Buckley had to go through the same evolution throughout his life of being just as critical of the civil rights movement as popular opinion would bear at any given time. We've gone through in here some, all the kind of the stuff where it descended into rather sexist comments is not very interesting. But the part that they're on now, I think, is actually that the point that Hitchens made about the politicization of things, I think, is now getting us to what is an actually, I don't know how much it relates to whether there's a liberal crack up the framing question of the debate, because the debate is not very well organized, but this Hitchens, when Hitchens says, I thought it was really, really interesting when he says, well, we find things political. We don't politicize things. We point out the political dynamics inherent in things. And he gives the example of the nuclear age, and that's obviously very relevant right now as people are sort of having this realization again that we're always constantly under the threat of nuclear annihilation, and we depend on 2 or 3 people not to press the button. But and then Buckley commits kind of either a fallacy or a misinterpretation of Hitchens. He accuses Hitchens of something he's not saying, which is, he says, I'm not saying, well, just because the nuclear age is political, that doesn't mean that the women's situation is the same political, which is true. But Hitchens was not. He says it doesn't follow. Buckley says it doesn't follow from one to the other. Well, but Hitchens wasn't saying that it followed from one to the other. He was showing how a situation could be political, and the calling out of it was not politicizing it, but pointing out the politics. And I think the question of what politicizing something is and what even politics are is kind of interesting here. I mean, the way I understand it, Ben, I'd be interested in your definition, is I understand that politics are the kind of debates over the use of power, the power to get people to do things. And so the way in which the nuclear weapons threat is political is that it's the question of who has the power to end the world or end our lives. And the way in which the situation of women in the 1950s was inherently political was that women lacked the power to do certain things, and their life situations were dictated to them by an explicit patriarchy, a group of men who had more power than they did. And this is a thing that I think this idea of politics as the distribution, as the mechanism by which power is distributed and used, is something that I think eludes both Buckley and Terrell here.
No, I think so. And although I think Buckley is, as usual, not being quite as ridiculous as Terrell. Like Terrell, I actually found Terrell's response to the line about nuclear war really interesting, because, I mean, Hitchens is, what Hitchens seems to mean by things were already political is we're already a victim of something that's politically objectionable, right? What you're calling making it political is just trying to do something about it. And so he gives, so he's giving the example of the threat of nuclear annihilation, which, as you say, is very, very, very topical. And Terrell's response is to say, well, you sound like some fanatic libertarian who say that it's already political that we're being taxed. And I just found that response bizarre, because it's like, of course, how
taxation? Yes, that's political.
Taxation is as political as anything possibly could be. Of course, that's already political. I mean, the problem with the fanatical libertarian is that they have a bad position on it. Not that they hold the belief that it's already politicized. I mean, obviously, how much people are taxed is a political issue, and always has been, and could never not be. And what are you talking about?
So you think taxation is political?
Like, yes, this is, the distribution of wealth is one of the primary things that politics is about and has always been about. Like, this is what the Magna Carta was about. I mean, that's like, how could that not be political? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Good point. Yeah. All right.
I think the cat is more insightful than Emmett Terrell.
A little bit less than Buckley and much less than Hitchens, but more than Terrell.
Much more than Terrell.
Much more than Terrell. Fair enough. Yeah. No. It's a bizarre thing. I mean, I think that I guess maybe we should treat this just as a weird eccentricity of Emmett Terrell, and think instead that he's being that he's just being very clumsy about how he puts it, right? But I mean, I think it's kind of a very common conservative thing, because this is a rhetorical position that conservatives do like to strike a lot. That's like, I'm not obsessed with politics like you people, right? I just want to grill and then maybe also invade Iraq. That's and I think that the core thing is that probably what they really mean is, like, what does it mean to say, that the ladies shouldn't have made the not being able to vote or start a bank account all political? Like, what does it mean to say, oh, you shouldn't be all political about the possibility of World War III? I think it really means that you should just accept the conditions that you're in without complaint. I mean, I think that's what it really gets down to. But yeah, so I think Jesus, Terrell said something else really stupid, but I've forgotten it. Since we since we started doing it, I'm sure he said. I know there was something else that I meant to point out in all of this. Yeah. Oh, okay. Actually, this was it. I think just the thing about America and Americanness is maybe worth highlighting a little bit. I mean, like Hitchens had a good line, right? He clearly likes the country. He did much more than what Terrell did to be part of it. But like, I do think that this is something that actually I'll do a give credit where credit's due thing here and attribute this, say that this was very well said in a debate that was a little while before my debate with Charlie Kirk. The YouTube streamer Vosh did one, and I am not a big fan of a lot of his recent commentary. I don't like the anarcho-NATOism, but
that's a good name for it.
He did have a very well put thing in that debate with Kirk, where he basically, I'm going to paraphrase slightly, but I remember him making this point very well in that debate, that it's kind of ridiculous to say that you love this country so much that you don't actually want to improve it in any way or make anything better for anybody who lives here. Like that's just a sort of innately bizarre, thing to say. That's like, no, I'm much too attached to the United States to want to improve conditions for anybody who lives in the United States. And I think that that's a lot of what this gets down to. A lot of this sort of I love America and Americanness and stuff like this. Well, what does that actually mean in practice, except that you don't actually want things to be better for anybody who lives in the United States who currently.
How could they be better? We live in the best of all possible Americas.
Fair enough. Let's watch the last part.
Okay, let's finish this up.
Now, I deny that we ought to permit ourselves to be so politicized. Do not deny that the effort is being made. Do insist that effort can be successfully resisted. But before we've only got a minute or two left. You've made 3 hit-and-run remarks about Vietnam. The last one was the unjust war.
Yes.
Lots of volumes have been written on Vietnam, but let me record that I had no reason 15 years ago to think it was unjust. As days go by, I'm progressively convinced that which was unjust about it was our desertion in the field of people whom we had rallied to the cause of liberty in the course of explicating a series of arrangements made with the benediction of your government, labor and non-labor, and the governments of the Western Europe during the 50s.
Just to their eternal shame, yes, that's quite
well.
right.
I don't think that Churchill would be embarrassed by it, nor Bevan, nor Cripps.
But the war ended. The war ended in a squalid and dishonorable way, as it was bound to. That's how it began. It began in a squalid and dishonorable way.
I don't doubt that it did.
It couldn't have been otherwise.
It is that. Well, what do you mean?
Nothing became it, as it were, like the leaving of it. It began in a squalid, dishonorable way.
The leaving of it hardly became it. If you mean 200,000 boat people became or leaving Vietnam, I think that you have no.
You were talking of the American departure from Vietnam.
What were you talking about?
I was talking about the American departure from Vietnam. I was replying to you about that.
And
in my opinion, a war so squalidly conceived could hardly have been honorably ended. The Vietnam War ended in 1954 when French colonialism was defeated at Dien Bien Phu. That's when the war was lost. And that's who lost it. All subsequent depredations by successive American governments, often supported by the British government, but never, I think, by the French, who'd learned their lesson by then. De Gaulle warned Kennedy a long time ago what would happen.
Do you believe that the resistance to communism is squalid?
No, I didn't say that.
No, I don't understand even the logic of what you say.
No, I don't blame you for trying to. And I don't blame you for trying to change the subject. I was talking about who lost the Vietnam War and when and why. I'm offering you my view.
It's like saying that the Philippines. Really, when we pulled out of the Philippines in 1948, we in effect ended a relationship with Filipinos who were democracy oriented. The Hooks really are the natural heirs of the. I simply deny it. I see no reason at all why that mad poet, Ho Chi Minh, specializing in torture and oppression, should have been encouraged when there is ample evidence to believe that there were enough South Vietnamese who preferred liberty and who should have been convinced that we had no neo-colonialist designs in South Vietnam.
Ho Chi Minh was good enough to be an American ally against the Japanese during the Second World War, when he became acknowledged as the leader of Vietnamese nationalism, whatever his other Stalinist traits may be, which I don't deny or seek to deny.
Stalin was good enough to be an ally against Hitler, so what?
Well, so quite a lot, as a matter
So
of fact.
not very much.
No, I think so. A good deal.
So Churchill
So
was
good
true.
deal. So
Was true
actually-
correct that under certain circumstances we would make contracts with the devil.
Quite.
Not particularly flattering. This is the kind of thing that unhappily the world is made up of, where so many political choices need to be made.
Tough
Where would
ones,
you resist
tough ones,
communism?
tough ones too.
Where would you resist communism? Where
Well-
would you resist a communist overthrow of government?
Yeah, with what weapons do you mean?
With force.
Both
what
questions.
about-
Both questions are good. With nuclear weapons, I wouldn't. There are no circumstances which would justify unleashing thermonuclear weapons. No outcome could be worse than that. So, which I don't think is your own opinion. I think that's to say there are worse things than communism, and by saying it, that's what I mean by it. In case you might want to reinterpret what
so
I
you
said.
would be in favor of unilateral disarmament, as Neil Kinnock is.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
yes.
So
Obviously, if
so
you
therefore-
don't, if you're not going to use weapons of genocide and suicide, you
You-
shouldn't be preparing to use them.
So
No,
you prefer biological survival to freedom, and that's a very important
I
point
don't
to make.
prefer it, but I would. I
Well, obviously
would,
prefer it.
You said
I
you
would
prefer
wait.
it.
I don't say those are the alternatives. Perhaps I should have spoken.
Unhappily,
Perhaps I
that
should have
would have to be
spoken less
flippant.
less rapidly. I
Thank
don't. If
you.
those are the choices, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Christopher Hitchens, and thank you to R. Emmett Tyrrell, author of The Liberal Crack-Up. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of Yonkers Prep.
Awesome.
Yeah, there's a lot that I actually in those last couple minutes that happens with Buckley initiates by saying, you keep making remarks about Vietnam, so now we need to discuss Vietnam. We now need to discuss Vietnam in the remaining 4 minutes that we have. I mean, Hitchens makes I think what is his line? He says, I don't think war could have been ended honorably that began in such a squalid way. Well, again, squalid is a little bit of an understatement there. But the point that he's making is, which unfortunately, because Emmett Tyrrell interjects and goes, "Would you resist communism? Would you resist? You're not anti-communist," and because it gets sidetracked with the whole thing about, we are allied with Stalin or whatever. It sort of distracts from, and it's a shame that the program ended, because the Hitchens point about the Vietnam War is really a useful one, which is that when the French lost at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, he's saying that at that point, that was when the Vietnamese nationalists had successfully ended colonialism, and the United States was committed to making sure that Ho Chi Minh's government didn't prevail, and then dragged out for 20 years, causing millions of deaths. This horrible, futile effort to impose on South Vietnam a government that did not have popular support in South Vietnam. And it's a point that he was starting to make quite well, and it's unfortunate that that Buckley kind of didn't grasp, because I think it's very valuable to say that, because Buckley was to draw the term, well, we abandoned South Vietnam, 1970s, we abandoned, we should have kept it up. And Hitchens' point, you couldn't. When was it going to go well? How were you ever going to end that well, considering what you were trying to do, which is impose an unpopular government against a guerrilla insurgency?
Yeah, no, exactly. Like that. This is the point. Look, I mean, I'll do a second, giving credit where credit's due, and say that I've read an article that claimed that in the the meetings in the beginning of the Obama administration to decide what their policy was going to be in Afghanistan, Joe Biden was apparently the one person asking skeptical questions in those meetings, and like trying to press people. I'd like, okay, but do you really think that if we do this in 4 years or 8 years, then there's going to be a stable pro-America government that's going to survive when we leave? And if not, what's the point?
Yeah. Well, that's a great comparison, because conservatives today can point to the Biden administration's pullout of Afghanistan and say, "Oh, this is squalid and dishonorable. Look, we've abandoned Afghanistan to the Taliban." But and indeed, the situation is horrific, and actually now being made worse by Biden's sanctions and stealing all of the Afghan central bank's money. But the point is valuable, that if you just look at the pullout and say, "Look, we abandoned these people," you ignore the fundamental question, which is, well, okay, but what was the end game ever going to be here? And I think this is a valuable point about the Vietnam War as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the point about the seizing the central bank assets is an important one, because it shows you that it's not that, like, the fact that Biden was saying things like that even under the Obama administration, or there's another article that claimed that in the second term, when John Kerry was the Secretary of State, Kerry wanted the United States to be more involved in the civil war in Syria, send advisors, and Biden, and Biden was like kind of mocking him for it. Says, do you remember Vietnam, John? Do you remember how it started? Or the fact that Biden was in fact willing to stick with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, even when he was being crucified for it in the media, or the fact that now he is saying, actually on the show on Monday, we showed the tweet where he essentially said, I'm not going to start World War III in Ukraine. And the responses to it were just like overflowing with people being like, well, why not? Right? Like why? That's so weak. And I think in all of these cases, it's not that Biden has somehow gone from a lifetime of voting for wars to being some sort of anti-imperialist. I mean, clearly not. I think it's, and I think the freezing of the central bank assets really shows that difference, right? It's not that he's not motivated by concern for the Afghans, right? It's just, but he is at least, I mean, this is the lowest of bars, but it's something. And like right now, it might be the only thing that's preserving human civilization.
Yes, I mean, it's self-interest, actually. It's actually a slightly more rational commitment to the preservation of the United States national interest, right? Understanding that the war in Afghanistan does not, in fact, serve us. It's like being opposed to the war in Iraq on the not because you care about the people of Iraq, but because you care about the people of the United States, and opposing and opposing a no-fly zone in Ukraine, not because you care about the people there, but because you don't want everyone you love to perish in an inferno.
Right, exactly. So, as I said, it's a low bar, but it is the low bar that's standing between us and everybody perishing in a nuclear inferno. So I'm grateful for it at the moment. But yeah, I think that Biden is at least willing to make certain kinds of like level-headed calculations of imperial self-interest and realize that, spending another 20 years in Afghanistan or obliterating all of human civilization, would be bad for American interests.
Thank God, because what if one of these no-fly zone people was president?
Exactly.
Fucking terrifying. Like there were a bunch of people. There were people in Congress. Like it wouldn't take much to have one of these crazy people in the White House, and they could do it.
Yes,
it's alarming.
Absolutely. It is extremely alarming. I mean, like, go back to LBJ from earlier in the debate. I mean, I think that the fact that he became president when he did is probably good in certain respects. I think he probably fought a lot harder for civil rights laws than JFK was ever going to. But if Johnson had become president a few years earlier, we wouldn't exist, because during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was definitely in the, this makes us look weak, we need to be bombing the airfields crowd.
Yeah, well, and Khrushchev, of course, has a quote where he says that all of his advisors were telling him not to back down, but then he realized it would end the world. So thank God that Khrushchev was completely insane. But it's very concerned when you see. I don't know if you saw that clip Ryan Grimm posted of all the journalists at the press conference going to Jen Psaki like, "Why aren't we sending more weapons? More weapons? More war? More war?" And not like, "Why aren't we?" What are we doing to end this war? But like, no-fly zone. Why are we doing the no-fly zone? And it's you realize how quickly all of this could escalate.
Yeah, no, exactly. But in any case, we should probably wrap up. I actually I need to finish an article tonight for you, actually. So
get on it.
Yeah. So I'm going to do that, but we will be back on Monday with this has already been released for patrons, but it'll be the main event on Monday is my conversation with Gregory Sadler about teaching philosophy in prison and a bunch of other interesting subjects. So people should check that out. In Monday's episode, people should be reading Current Affairs.
Indeed.
I said
latest
earlier
British issue
tonight,
article by Ben Burgess. So currentaffairs.org/subscribe. You can read it immediately.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't got my print issue yet, but I've seen the PDF and it looks very nice. So yeah, that's and I said earlier that the three people I said earlier tonight on Twitter that the three people I'd recommend reading right now for a sane perspective on what's going on with various aspects of Russia, Ukraine, possibly World War III, etc. I said Branko Marketic and Jacobin, and Cuba Warinsky, who from This Revolution, who's been posting very long and informative Twitter threads, probably has the most like sort of granular expertise about a lot of this than anybody I know on the left. And Nathan in Current Affairs. If you read I think the things that you've been writing about, about responses to the invasion, about the sort of insanity of all the anti-appeasement rhetoric, about Russophobia, about the fact that World War III is something that we should worry about and that it would be bad if it happened. I think are things that I would really like everybody to read and think about as much as all possible.
It's concerning to be one of the few in the press making this point.
That World War III would be bad. Yes, I would like to live in a world where that wasn't a hot take. But in any case, that's not the world that we're living in right now because everybody's. It is astounding how much the media, the mainstream media, would like there to be a World War III right now, or whatever. It won't be a real World War III. We'll just shoot down some Russian planes and they won't do anything because that's a safe calculation. But in any case,
well, it'd be great for the clicks in the 5 minutes before we all died. The clicks would go through the roof.
Yeah. I had the thought a little while ago. It's like, well, I guess if there's a no-fly zone and human civilization doesn't come to an end, I'll sure feel silly. But for writing what I've written about that. But on the other hand, I think I'll be great. I think I'll be grateful to look silly. So I'll be okay with it. I would much rather look like I called this wrong than die a horrible fiery death along with everybody I've ever known or loved.
I mean, the Biden administration said openly that it would be World War III. I mean, they said that.
They did.
Actually, it was shocking. I mean, to hear them say that, really, but that's their position too. So it's not a crazy position. It's just a shame that it's limited to you, me, and Joe Biden, apparently.
Fair enough. All right.
All right.
Thanks, Nathan.
I enjoyed it a lot.
Sorry. What did you say? I cut you off.
I was saying that that episode of Fire Line was pretty stupid, but I loved it. That discussion was.
Yeah.
That was fun.
Thoroughly enjoyed it. Thoroughly
some good
enjoyed
points in there.
watching.
Yeah.
Watching an interesting discussion between Christopher Hitchens and William F. Buckley, as William F. Buckley was carrying Emmett Terrell on his back and just trying to get him through it. So fair enough. All right. Well, we'll call it a night. Left is best.